Most people know Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and was murdered for trying to save Rome. Most people know Augustus ended the Republic and rebuilt it as an empire. What most people don't know is that the real story began almost a century earlier with two brothers who saw exactly what was coming, who tried by entirely legal means to stop it. Who were the two brothers, both killed by the very system they were trying to fix? Their names were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and in my view, their story is one of the most, if not the most, important one in Roman history that almost nobody tells properly, because it doesn't end with a battle or triumph. It ends with a warning that went completely unheeded, and a republic that spent the next 100 years slowly paying the price for ignoring it. To understand the Gracchi brothers, we have to understand what was happening to Roman society in the 2nd century BC. Rome had been conquering territory for generations. The legions were winning. The empire was growing, and yet something was quietly breaking inside the city itself. The problem was land. Roman law technically limited how much public land, the ager publicus, any single citizen could hold. In practice, wealthy aristocrats had been ignoring that limit for decades, absorbing enormous stretches of territory that were supposed to be available to ordinary Romans. And the men who farmed that land, the small farmers, who had always formed the backbone, both the economy and the Roman army, were being slowly squeezed out. Many lost their farms entirely. They drifted into the city, propertyless, unemployed, and increasingly desperate. And here was made this not just a social problem but a military crisis. Roman law required soldiers to own property, no military service. The army that had built the empire was running out of the kind of men it needed to sustain itself. Rome was getting richer and weaker at the same time, and almost no one in power wanted to admit it. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the people in 133 BC. He came from one of Rome's most distinguished families. His grandfather had defeated Hannibal. His mother Cornelia was one of the most educated and respected women in Rome. He was not revolutionary. He was not trying to overthrow anything. He proposed a relatively simple reform: enforce the existing land laws, redistribute the access back to the landless poor, and stabilize the population that Rome's army actually depended on. The reform was not radical. The laws he wanted enforced already existed. The Senate, largely composed of the exact wealthy families who had been ignoring those land laws for generations, was not interested. And what happened next changed Roman politics permanently. When the Senate blocked his reform through a veto by a fellow tribune named Octavius, Tiberius did something almost no Roman politician had done before. He brought the question directly to the people, bypassed the Senate entirely, and had Octavius removed from office by popular vote. This was technically legal. It was also, by the standards of Roman tradition, a serious breach of the unwritten rules everyone had agreed to follow. Tradition in Rome was not just custom, it was the glue that held the whole political structure together, and Tiberius had just publicly demonstrated that it could be bypassed. The reform passed, the Land Commission began its work, and then Tiberius made one more move that his enemies had been waiting for. He announced he would stand for re-election as tribune, something that had essentially never been done before. His supporters argued he needed another term to protect the reforms he had just passed. His opponents argued he was accumulating power in a way that looked dangerously like a tyrant. And on election day, a group of senators and their supporters surrounded him in the forum. They beat him to death with chairs and benches. His body was thrown into the Tiber. He was 33 years old at the time. The Senate called it a necessary act to protect the Republic. And in my view, it was the moment the Republic began to die, not because of what Tiberius had done, because of what his killers had just established as acceptable behavior, that political murder was a valid response to the reform you disagreed with. Once that line was crossed, it never fully uncrossed again. Every political murder that followed, Gaius, Caesar, Cicero, drew on the same logic. We are protecting the Republic. We are simply removing a threat. The Republic survived each killing a little less than it had survived the one before. 10 years passed, and then Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius' younger brother, was elected tribune. He had watched everything, and he came back with a much broader program than his brother had ever attempted. Gaius extended grain subsidies to the poor. He proposed extending Roman citizenship to Italian allies. He pushed for new colonies to absorb the landless. He tried to reform the courts that were dominated entirely by senators who had just spent a decade dismantling his brother's work. He was also, by most accounts, an extraordinary speaker. Cicero later called him one of the greatest orators Rome ever produced. He understood in a way Tiberius perhaps hadn't, that reform needed popular momentum to survive. He was not just proposing policies, he was building a political coalition broad enough that killing him would be much harder than killing his brother had been. And for a while it worked. He was re-elected, the program moved forward, and then the Senate found a way to peel away his coalition piece by piece. A rival tribune began outbidding Gaius for popular support, promising even more than Gaius was offering, knowing none of it would actually be delivered. When Gaius tried to stand for third term, he lost. The coalition his brother had never managed to build, Gaius had built and then watched dissolve. And then what followed was swift and brutal. The Senate passed something called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree that essentially suspended normal legal protections and authorized the consuls to use whatever force was necessary to restore order. It had never been used before. It would be used again, against Caesar and against others. Each time it was used, it normalized the idea a little further that emergency powers could justify almost anything. Gaius fled across the Tiber with his supporters. Surrounded, he reportedly asked a slave to kill him, rather than be taken alive. His body was decapitated. His head was brought to the consul, reportedly filled with lead to increase its weight, since a reward had been offered for its measured by weight. 3,000 of his supporters were killed in the aftermath. He was around 33 years old, exactly the same age as his brother when he died. Their mother Cornelia outlived both of her sons. She reportedly bore it with remarkable composure, telling people who came to console her that men who had done what Tiberius and Gaius had done deserved monuments, not tears. Whether that composure was real or performed for an audience, no one could say. Probably both, as these things usually are. What strikes me most about the Gracchi brothers, looking back at the story, is how completely right they were about the problem and how completely the system refused to let them fix it. The land crisis they identified was real. The military consequences were real. Within a generation of their deaths, a general named Marius would reform the army along exactly the lines the Gracchis had pointed toward, recruiting the landless poor directly, creating professional soldiers loyal to their commanders rather than to the state. That reform, made necessary by the very crisis the Gracchi brothers had tried to address, produced the conditions that made Caesar possible, which produced the conditions that made Augustus possible, which ended the Republic entirely. The men who killed Tiberius and Gaius to protect the Republic ended up creating the exact conditions that destroyed it. And in my opinion, this is the central tragedy of Roman Republican history, not Caesar, not Brutus, not even Augustus. Two brothers, a generation earlier, who were right about everything and were killed before anything they proposed could fully take hold. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus are not household names. Caesar is, Augustus is, even Cicero is, but in my view, the story of the Republic's collapse begins with the two brothers who saw what was coming, tried to stop it through entirely understandable means, and were beaten and beheaded for it. Their mother outlived them both. She said they deserved monuments, not tears. The monuments never came. The Republic they died trying to save did not survive either. The men who killed them thought they were protecting something precious. What they were actually doing was proving for the first time that it could be killed. And once a thing like that is proven, it tends to be proven again and again.